Thank you. Welcome to Syracuse Neurofeedback's part of this. I want to thank Natur-Tyme and Wendy Meyerson for constructing their new community room. It's great. Years ago, when I first started doing neurofeedback, Wendy invited me to the community room on Bridge Street, and it was very nice. And then they outgrew it, and now they're in a larger space so they have the community room back. The brain is what is controlling all of our emotions, all of our actions, and when we start getting symptoms, that indicates that the brain has failed somewhere in that regulation. Now, how do we address that failure? Brain neuronal bundles don't act like a solid wire. They act like a multi-stranded wire. You have many neurons in a cable, if you will, conducting the same information. So if you lose one neuron, no big deal. I can't lose my ability to speak or move my arm if just one nerve cell dies. But as we go through life, there are neurotoxins, there are environmental things that we're exposed to, we have genetic predispositions, and we can start losing neurons. The death of the neuron is called apoptosis. And as you lose neurons in this neuron bundle, the throughput drops. So if you're putting 1,000 nanovolts in one end of this, and a serotonin bundle can be 12 to 16 inches long, by the time it gets to the output, that output can start dropping as we start losing nerves along the length of that axonal bundle. The brain, it doesn't act like a dimmer switch. So as that output is dropping, it's not like a dimmer switch, it's like an on-off switch. The regulation that nerve bundle is doing is either fully on or fully off. And as it drops, it reaches a certain threshold, and if it drops below that, that nerve bundle is not doing its regulatory job. And the objective of all the interventions is to get that nerve bundle above that threshold. So if you approach it pharmacologically, what are they trying to do with medicines? They're trying to increase the throughput of that nerve bundle. So if you're doing like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, like the Prozacs and Zolofts of the world, what they are doing is increasing the neurotransmitter content, the concentration in that synapse, the gap between those neurons. You have the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. The presynaptic neuron is going to manufacture a neurotransmitter and store it in a vesicle. When a signal comes through, that vesicle goes to the cell wall, ruptures, drops neurotransmitters into that synapse that diffuse across. Receptor sites grab a hold of that, and when enough receptor sites are triggered, then the nerve impulse continues down the next nerve, the postsynaptic neuron. When that postsynaptic neuron notices a drop in current flow, it sends a signal to the presynaptic neuron, and there's a reuptake port. There's a port that grabs those neurotransmitters from the synapse and pumps them back into the presynaptic nerve for reuse. And so it tells that presynaptic nerve to shut that port, that reuptake port. Well, the reuptake inhibitors, like Prozac, they are going to block that port also. And all of that is to increase the concentration of neurotransmitters, to increase that throughput and remove symptoms. Well, what does the body do? The body is designed, it says in this synapse we are supposed to have a certain level of neurotransmitters. Now all of a sudden this neurotransmitter level is high. Well, it tries to lower it. And it has two enzymes, the catecholamine oxymethyltransferase enzyme and the monoamine monoamine oxidase enzyme. Those enzymes break the neurotransmitters apart and flush them away as waste. And they're concentration motivated. So when they see a higher concentration in the synapse, they go into high gear and they start breaking it down and flushing it away. What we haven't done is increase the production rate. So as they break it away, the concentration and availability of neurotransmitters in that presynaptic neuron drops. And so then that restricts the amount that it is able to release into the synapse. The body reestablishes normal neurotransmitter levels and symptoms return. So that is why when you take one of those medications, you experience what the time when that medication stops working. It's called tachyphylaxis. The medical community knows it happens. They know why it happens. They just don't have a way of overcoming it. So what do? They change medications, or they increase the medications, but all of those medications have side effects. You increase the side effects. So medications, that's how they're working on that nerve. More than one way to skin a cat. Neurotransmitters, the body makes them. How can we stimulate more of them? In neurofeedback, what neurofeedback is a way of exercising that nerve bundle. When we exercise it, we increase the blood flow, increase the production rate of neurotransmitters, which the medicines don't. In time, it'll start growing more synapses. The brain will reroute around a damaged nerve bundle. And in Alzheimer's research of all things, they found that Alzheimer's patients would regrow whole new neuronal bundles to reconnect the brain. Incredible. And so in our practice, we're actually rebuilding little brains. There's another way. A physician by the name of Marty Hinz developed a way to supplement the amino acids that the body uses to make neurotransmitters. And if you supplement them in balance, you can establish neurotransmitter levels anywhere you want without side effects. And we can talk about that a little bit later. Neurofeedback is where I started in all this 12 years ago. We added this amino acid supplement program in May of 2006. And so we have some options. But today is mostly on neurofeedback, because neurofeedback is going to restore that function of that synapse by increasing the production rate of neurotransmitters, exercising that synapse. The postsynaptic neuron has a nerve that controls its sensitivity. And so we can adjust the sensitivity of those receptor sites and increase the throughput and restore function. So we'll get going in here. And neurofeedback is a learning technique. The brain is learning a new way to function. Biofeedback, which neurofeedback is a subset of, is when you can voluntarily learn to control an autonomic nervous system function. For example, hand temperature training is very effective for migraines and anxiety. You can take a digital thermometer, strap it, tape it to your finger, and you can increase the temperature of your finger As you increase the temperature of your finger, the only way to do that is to relax. So you're really training yourself how to relax. And when you can relax at will to maintain that peripheral temperature, you can control anxiety, you can shut off migraines in mid-migraine. There's a whole lot of things that you can do. The problem is it requires continuing vigilance. When I'm not focusing on my hand temperature, it goes back to normal. I'm an avid skier, and most of the time I'm skiing at night. The average temperature is going to be around 12 degrees. And so when I'm skiing with my buds flying down the slopes, I'm not thinking about my hand temperature. I'm thinking about carving turns and skiing. And then when you get on the lift to ride up, you're like, oh, this is cold out here, and your hands are cold, and your feet are cold, and I sit there while my buds are easing, and I just relax, and you feel blood rush to your hands and your feet. And I'm a little warm and toasty because I learned how to do that. But it requires a continuous vigilance. When I want my hands warm, I have to concentrate, think about it, and consciously override the autonomic nervous system function. With neurofeedback, you don't have to do that. When the brain learns its new way of operating, it does it automatically. You don't have to think about it. It just functions. One of my first clients 12 years ago, when I was just learning how to do this, had many things going on with this habit, including absent seizures and all sorts of stuff. And when he was stressed, he just functioned the way he wanted to function. He called me up one day, he was feedback for quite a while, and he said, "Oh, Barry, accident on 690. That was the last thing this guy needed. And I'm sorry to hear that." And he said, "No, story. The story is that when that driver's license information and got it fixed, when talked about it with my wife, had to survive with just one car. But then it occurred to me, he said, if that had happened before neurofeedback, he said, I couldn't have. It would have I would have walked the mall for 3 or 4 hours before I could have calmed down enough to even accept that I'd been in an accident or didn't have the car towed." He said, and it just happened normally. I didn't have to think about it. I didn't have to plan. I didn't realize it had happened normally until afterward. And that's the way it is with neurofeedback. When your brain is functioning well, that's supposed to be normal. I had clients come in with migraines, and as we're going through the training things, every time you come in, we'll ask you how your core symptoms have been doing. And I asked her when migraines. She goes, "What migraines?" I said, "Well, that's what you're coming for, migraines." She said, "Oh, I haven't had a migraine in weeks," and she had frequent migraines. And so it happens normally. It's not something you're going to have to think about. Everything just starts getting better. Whoops. I pressed the wrong button. There we go. It'll be. There are different brainwave structures or brainwave frequencies, different patterns, and they correspond to different things. And if you see more than I would expect, just by looking at someone's brainwave trace, I can normally ask the right questions. From 0 to 4 hertz at the top is delta. That's sleep, near sleep. They used to think that you only had those brainwaves when you were asleep, but it turns out that they're there in large numbers even when you're awake. And early traumas and early memories are stored in delta. And so if I look on the screen and I see sky-high delta, I start asking questions, what happened to you when you were before the age of 7? Theta, 4 to 8 hertz. And theta gets a bad reputation because ADDers have lots of theta. Theta is daydreaming. It is when you're dreaming about when you were 5 years old and you saw the little bug crawl out of the water and become a dragonfly and fly away. You're in theta. Really nice to have, but not when you're trying to listen to your teacher in school or something like that, right? But theta isn't all bad. Creativity is in theta. Those aha moments where we have that flash of understanding is in theta. So it's not bad, it's the brain's ability to transition between all these different brainwave functions. If it gets stuck in any one place and limits access to one or the other, then you start getting compromised function. Alpha, 8 to 12 hertz. That's where the meditators go. When you're doing your breathing and you're doing your meditations and you get to that comfortable place where all is well with the world and you're comfortable in your place in it, everything is perfect. That's alpha. And if you've never experienced alpha and your instructors are giving you verbal instructions on how to reach it, it can be tough to get there if your brain is on the anxious side. And we can go and show you the path. SMR, 12 to 15 hertz, sensory motor rhythm. And that is where neurofeedback all began. They found out in NASA research that if you trained this 12 to 15 hertz range to increase the amplitude or loudness of that brainwave, seizures went away. And seizures were a problem in the early space flight. So they trained all of their astronauts to increase this sensory motor rhythm to minimize the incidence of seizures. They also then found out that learning disabilities went away. Headaches went away. Dyslexia went away. Depression, anxiety. A whole host of things got better when you just trained that one thing. And that was the beginning of neurofeedback as we see it today. It grew from that. Because the civilian world started treating epileptics, the NASA was training all of their test pilots, and they were tracking the results. And it turns out that it would actually increase your IQ. Imagine that. 15 to 18 hertz, beta, that's normal, conscious thought. So when you're thinking, you're planning, you're executing those plans, you're in beta. So when you're studying, you're in beta. High beta is anxiety, fear. And when you get even further up that into the gamma, it is sensory processing. So when I look at the brain and look at its brainwave structure, if I see an elevated high beta, the person has anxiety. You know that mind is really busy even if they aren't aware of the content. So just by looking at the brainwaves, you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on. That alpha, if there's a really low alpha, people are subject to addictions. And so I caution them against addictive substances. If the alpha is really high, I start asking about migraine headaches. It all began with epilepsy in the beginning. And then they found out that the attention deficits, the sleep disorders, depression, head injuries, all these other things fell into place. Even alcoholism, irritable bowel, Crohn's. Eugene Peniston, he was a PhD psychologist with the VA in Illinois. He just died 2 years ago. In the late 80s, he took 10 Vietnam-era vets that were persistent alcoholics. They had all been through between 4 and 5 inpatient dry-out programs, and they all relapsed persistently. These were the type of veterans that you see living under bridges. He took them inpatient one more time, and the only different thing was he did 10 sessions of hand temperature training for relaxation and anxiety control. And then he did 30 sessions of neurofeedback in a special type that we call deep state or alpha theta training. The end result was his criterion for success was that they'd never touch another drink, maintain a job, live independently, no halfway houses, no assisted living, and they maintain all of their family psychosocial relationships. So their relationship with their spouse and children, they had to maintain those relationships. Pretty tough criterion for a post-traumatic stress disorder drunk. Well, he did 3, 5, and 10-year follow-ups. 8 out of 10 met all criteria. Wow. Well, you ask, what happened to the other 2? The other 2 fell off the wagon, got back on the wagon because they couldn't physically tolerate the alcohol. They gave them flu-like symptoms. They met all other criteria. One of them died before the final study, and the other one at the end was able to drink socially without being an alcoholic, which is unheard of in the alcohol treatment field. They replicated his study with a number of times because he only claimed 80% success rate, but societally is 100% success. They replicated it with a 70% success rate amongst the Navajo Indians with peyote use. And the Cry Help inpatient substance abuse program out west is still using it with good success. When the brain fails, it has characteristic failure modes. Arousal here, we're talking about how awake that brain is, and performance. In normal function, you have a wide curve, and so you can change your arousal level without significant changes in performance. As the brain starts failing, this arousal curve compresses. And if you're under-aroused, you get boredom, drowsiness, omission errors on testing. If you're over-aroused, you get stress, fatigue, exhaustion, and commission errors. You get anxiety, fears. You get the tense muscles. The left brain, it tends to fail into an under-aroused condition, and it compresses this curve. So you get peak performance when you're slightly over-aroused. As soon as you under-arouse, performance just drops off. When you're over here, you get good performance. So how they treat that? They'll give you a stimulant to increase that arousal, to move you over here to where you function better. If the right brain tends to fail into an over-aroused condition, where your mind is going a mile a minute, it's hard to fall asleep, hard to calm down, you're stressed. So how do you treat that? With a depressant. Moves your arousal over here, you function better because you've climbed this curve, but you have this narrow little peak. And what happens if you get both at the same time? You have a narrow area where you function very high. You change your arousal level a little bit, and you jump off a cliff as far as performance. And you see that in things like bipolar disorder. In bipolar disorder, you see these brilliant people. They can accomplish the world when they're on top of their game. You change the arousal level a little bit one way or the other, then they're either manic or depressed and they're not functioning. With exercise, we can restore that normal curve. We're not really going to go through a whole lot with the neurotransmitters and what they control, because I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible so we can get to your questions. And we're going to go straight to the symptoms. If your brain has failed, what symptoms do you get? If the left brain has failed into under-arousal, you get spaciness, daydreaming, poor concentration, lack of motivation. If the right brain has failed, and we're looking just at attention symptoms here, you get impulsivity, distractibility, or hyperactivity. As you can have them both at the same time, or with unstable arousal where it's shifting back and forth, you can get the racing thoughts, hyperactivity with fatigue or sedatives. You know, you get your children that past their bedtime and they're bouncing off the walls. That's it. Emotional and behavioral symptoms. What do you see emotionally when the brain fails? If the left brain has failed to its preferred failure mode of under-arousal, you get depression. But it's a unique depression. It's a hopeless, helpless depression. It's the poor little me's. The world is this deep, dark place and it's all my fault. As opposed to the depression that you get with the right side, which is an agitated, an emotionally agitation. It's this internal disquiet and it's more outward focused. Completely different experiences with those depressions, but our English language calls them both depression. And so if you come to me and you say, oh, I feel depressed, I'm going to ask you, what does it feel like? To sort out, is this left side, is this right side, or is it a combination of both? Feelings easily hurt. Perfectionist. Anxiety, a cognitive worry, as opposed to anxiety on this side, which will be a fear-based anxiety. Because if it's an anxiety that is the butterflies in the tummy and the lump in the throat and your heart's pounding and you're like, that's a right-sided anxiety. If the anxiety is from the left side, it's a cognitive worry. And it doesn't matter how you solve it intellectually, it still bothers you. And they can conspire against you to work together. And it would go a scenario like this, where the car payment's due. The car payment was due the 15th. And here it is, 17th or 18th, and what am I going to do? And you know that you can pay the car payment. You can juggle accounts or you can do whatever. You can make the car payment, but it doesn't matter. You're still going to be worried about that car payment. Then the right side gets a hold of it. And it says, if I don't make that car payment, they're going to repossess my car. If they repossess my car, I can't go to work. If I can't go to work, I don't get a paycheck. If I don't get a paycheck, I lose the house. And next thing you know, my family's living under a bridge in Syracuse over a solvable problem. Irrational? Yes. But that's how the brain worked to get there. Easily embarrassed. I just had a young man, he's a pitcher for his Little League team, and we were training, and it was one of the first training sessions, and the mother came back and said, when he was pitching on the field, he was just, anytime he made an error, he was just so embarrassed he could barely get back out on the field. I said, okay, I know how to fix that. Raised the reward frequency on the left side, and the next time he came back, 3 days later, Mom says, oh, he's doing great on the field. No more embarrassment. Guilt, irritable, passive. That's all left brain under activation. And if we go to the right brain, what do we see? Poor comprehension and expression of emotions. There are people who don't understand. They can't read your emotions. You can be projecting all of the stern face or whatever. They don't see it. Anxiety, we went through that. Poor eye contact, social awareness, lack of cause and effect thinking. I see that a lot with ADHD kids. Poor awareness of appetite. You get these people, their mind's going a mile a minute. They're skinny as a rail because they can be starving, but they don't know it. Until they can relax, and then they're like, oh, I'm really hungry. You get the same thing with awareness of body needs. It's rather common. It'll be, especially if there's a child in the chair, it'll be training for 15, 20 minutes, and they're like, I'm starving, or I gotta pee. Unplug, they run to the restroom, they come back, and you hook them back up again. Because when they're in that high state of arousal, they lose that body awareness. So lack of body awareness, depression, the agitated, high pain tolerance. They don't feel it. Lacking empathy, shame, despair, you hold a grudge, manipulative, aggressive, impatient, agitation. Those are all from the right side. So when you come in, we'll be asking you what symptoms you have. Because that helps us sort out what structure in the brain do we have to exercise to increase the function on. So you have left under arousal, right over arousal. You can have them both at the same time. You can be anxious and depressed. You can have addictions. Instability, that's when the left and right side are sort of swapping back and forth. And so what do you get? You get mood swings, suicidal thoughts, panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, oppositional defiant behavior, PTSD symptoms, anorexia, bulimia. This is so effective with anorexia and bulimia that I won't treat you with anorexia unless you're seeing your talk counselor twice a week, because they get better so fast that it destabilizes them. Compulsive overeating. I have a young lady right now who's doing this. Delusions, dissociative symptoms, autistic symptoms, reactive attachment disorder. So when someone tells me they have these symptoms, I don't care what their diagnosis is, because the same brain failure mode is exhibiting itself in all these multiple ways. So you can come to me with a laundry list of diagnoses, but it's the same root failure. And the same exercising of the brain remediates it. Sleep. This is one of the things that we ask all the time, because one of the first responses to neurofeedback is often sleep. So if someone comes to me and they say, oh, I can't fall asleep. I put my head on the pillow and it takes me an hour and a half to fall asleep. I read 3 books, I watch whatever. I know what part of the brain to exercise. And generally, the first thing to fall into place is the sleep. Not always, but in general. Different functions. If the left brain is underactive, difficulty maintaining sleep. They can fall asleep, but they wake up in the middle of the night. But when they wake up, they're not waking up with a busy mind. They're just awake, staring at the ceiling, saying, why am I awake? Difficulty falling back to sleep. Difficulty waking up, and you're not rested, and snoring. Right over arousal, that's where you can't fall asleep for anything. It takes you hours or an extended time to fall asleep. And then if you wake up in the middle of the night, you may as well get up and go to work, because you're not going back to sleep because your mind's already at work and it's busy a mile a minute. Physically restless sleep, vivid dreams or nightmare, clenching your jaw. Did you ever meet anyone that talks to you through a clenched jaw? Tells me a whole world about how that brain is functioning. Instability, sleepwalking. bedwetting, panic attacks during sleep, restless leg syndrome, teeth grinding. See, clenching the jaw is just right-sided. Grinding it while you're asleep is both. It's an instability. And yes, we can shut off the teeth grinding. Dentists love us. Cognitive. So we're going through all these different symptoms. And so the cognitive symptoms, generally you see this particularly in people who are in school. You can, inability to write neatly, poor math concepts and spelling, poor tracking during reading, poor sense of direction, right-sided, lack of a sense of humor. On the left side, you see poor receptive or expressive language, poor sequential processing, reading comprehension, calculation. In math, there are those who, they understand the concepts. They can describe the concept of their math problems, but they're going to make errors. They can't do it mathematically. Then there are others, they can do all the calculations flawlessly, but they have no idea what it means. That also helps me know which side of the brain is failing. And we'll blast on through some of this so we have more time. Pain. Do you have a high pain threshold or a low pain threshold? Or emotionally reactive to pain? That's my son. He can be bleeding, have his arm cut off, he'll never notice until he sees the blood. And then he's like, ah! All right. Pain symptoms, headaches, trigeminal neuralgia, fibromyalgia. Had a woman a few years ago with trigeminal neuralgia. The trigeminal nerve comes down and it comes under the zygomatic arch, it feeds the face and jaw. So pain in the fascia all through here is a result of that trigeminal nerve. If that trigeminal nerve is irritated, you get a pretty acute pain. This woman had so much pain she could not or would not eat. She drank liquids. Everything was pureed. She had so much pain she would not speak. Well, I got a phone call to book the appointment for her, and she had gone to Enable, and the Enable person, she was writing what she wanted, and he was talking on the phone to me to book the appointment. She was also chemically sensitive. When she first came into the office, she looked like a bag lady. It was wintertime. She had barely enough clothes on to be decent in the summertime, and there were holes in it. Because if the cloth irritated her, she'd take scissors and cut the holes so it wouldn't irritate. It was a rather interesting presentation. And she was making slow, steady progress. So we actually got her onto home training, and Priscilla was following her. Well, one day I got a phone call, and I couldn't place who the person was. I had never heard her name pronounced correctly, and I had never heard her voice. And here she was telling me how great she was doing. I had no idea who she was for a while. And she says, "It's me." I said, "Well, I've never heard you speak before." She had regained her ability to speak. She was functioning at a much higher level. Pretty cool. So neurological motor symptoms. Left brain underactivation, incontinence. Right brain over-arousal, poor balance, poor coordination, nervous habits, chewing. So there's a whole lot of symptoms. It doesn't matter whether it's a seizure or a vertigo, spasticity, vocal tics, motor tics. When you come in and you tell us what you're dealing with, multiple chemical sensitivities, irritable bowel, asthma, chronic fatigue syndrome, we're going to be figuring out where, kill all of it, figuring out where it fits in on the spectrum for how the brain has failed. That leads us to where do we put the sensors on the head? Because what we're going to be doing, and thank you very much, Priscilla, for bringing this in, specific sites on the head correspond to specific symptoms. The sensors only read the brain waves. Nothing's going into the sensors. I'm not plugging them into the wall and doing some ECT. They read the brain waves. It goes to an amplifier, which then goes to a computer, and that computer then controls input to the individual. There'll be a visual component. It may be a game that you're playing, or it may be just a movie. We can just pop a movie in, and the progress of that movie can become the feedback. And we have a vibrating teddy bear. What we're going to be asking the brain to do in order to exercise that bundle, we're going to ask it to make one brain wave under one sensor, the exact same brain wave under another sensor, and then change the timing between the two, the phasing, and maintain that phase shift. In order to do that, the brain has to work a whole lot harder than it does on any given day. In order to accomplish it, it has to increase the blood supply. The increase in blood supply increases the available raw materials for neurotransmitter generation. We can increase neurotransmitter production. We're also going to be able to adjust the neuronal network so that it changes the sensitivity of that receptor site complex. So a smaller amount of neurotransmitters can trigger the postsynaptic neuron and increase that throughput, which everything is about increasing the throughput. So by exercising that brain's ability to generate those two waveforms and change the timing between them, that's the basis of it all. By targeting where we put the sensors, we're targeting specific symptoms. So if you tell me that I have explosive rages, the slightest thing sets me off, we'll be training in part here to here. Here to here is for rate and magnitude of emotional response. How fast is my anxiety or fear or anger going to come in? How big is it going to be? When I exercise the brain's ability to regulate that, it all by itself suppresses that symptom and starts behaving in a more normal manner. So a little kid that's turning her mother black and blue with her rages, kicking the walls out, settles down and becomes a little angel. I have a father. He has a 3-year-old daughter. Is she 3 or 4? Somewhere in there. He had explosive rages. If he was working on the computer and it didn't do what he wanted, he wasn't this, come on. He would break the computer. If he was working on his car or something and he bumped his head, he would break whatever it was. And he told me just yesterday, he said, I hope that my daughter can forget all of that. He says, I hope that my daughter will only remember me as I am now, calm, cool, and collected, with no rages. Because he's been through neurofeedback. He no longer explodes. He's enjoying doing things around the house and working on his car that he couldn't tolerate before. He's not flying off the handle all the time. His daughter also comes in for neurofeedback. So we can target specific symptoms by where on the head we're exercising it. And once the brain learns to do it, it doesn't forget. It takes repetition. And so it's not a one-time thing. So we catch the brain doing the brainwave structure we want at random and reward it. The brain likes the reward, and then we'll then change to maintain that reward. Pretty cool. I want to give time to address your specific things. So, any questions? Yes. Sure. All right. And when we're doing this, we have these traces. It's pretty cool because I can go and look at those traces and I can explain to the person, this is what's happening here. The brain compensates for functioning. One of the big things that we see are people who are stuck in fight and flight. And it changes everything. If I sustain a large emotional trauma, for example, what was it, 1991 plus or minus a year, my grandfather died. I was very close to my grandfather. I mean, we were like this, and had been since I was tiny. He was my hero. He wasn't sick. He just died, unexpectedly. Well, what do you do when you get the call? They lived in Maine. I, at the time, was living in Massachusetts. You can't curl up in a corner and cry for 3 days, right? You have to function. You've got to go. You've got to plan the funeral. Who's going to be a pallbearer? Families coming in from the world over. They need hotels. They need food. They need cars. It's a private cemetery. You have to have contractors to do everything from dig the hole to make sure the access is clear. There are things that have to happen. Well, how does the brain function in that scenario? It uses a structure in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is in charge of your fight and flight response, among other things. It increases the arousal level of your whole brain. And when you're in that fight and flight response, if you're going to fight for your life or run for your life, you don't care if your mother loves you, right? Emotional content is entirely irrelevant. Your life is at stake. So what does it do? It completely shuts off the alpha and theta. Stomps straight down into the ground. It increases the high beta. Because that high beta, that high arousal, is shifting and it's suppressing that emotional content. You're going to run for your life or you're going to fight for your life. And it stays in that function while I'm functioning, while I'm doing all the stuff, my eulogy, all that stuff. Then, after everything is done, all the family's gone, when you're in an emotionally safe place and a physically safe place at the same time, the brain will lower that arousal level to allow you access to the alpha and theta again. And the brain will begin processing the memories of my grandfather. Because originally, the memories of my grandfather are completely encapsulated with the emotional trauma of the loss, right? Any memory of my fishing with my grandfather brings up that emotional loss. In a healthy, high-functioning brain, over the next 12 months, when you're in stage 1 sleep, the brain is going to separate out the memory of my grandfather and the emotional content of the loss and store them in separate places. Approximately 12 months later, I can remember all those fishing trips. I can remember all those wonderful things with my grandfather without that emotional content being there. What happens if I don't have that physically safe place or that emotionally safe place? I stay in high beta. My emotional content is restricted. I can't process emotional things. I can't react appropriately to emotional things. I am in this high stress. Remember all those stress symptoms when you're in over-arousal? You're anxious, you're irritable, you're angry, or you're depressed, and it's an angry depression. Because the brain can't transition out of that supposedly temporary state. That means that future emotional events don't get processed either. So the daily processing of minor emotional things doesn't get processed. The subconscious mind wants to process all that stuff. And so when something makes me angry, the subconscious mind goes through all that stored up backlog of stuff and says, anything here with anger, let's go now. But the door's cracked open and it shoves it all out. And you get this huge burst of anger for a small trigger. Or maybe it's a huge burst of fear for a small trigger. You get this large emotional response from a small trigger. That's from being stuck in this high beta. That's the beginnings of PTSD. You know, on a sliding scale. What do? We teach the brain to shut off that high beta. We don't have to tell it to make more alpha and theta, it just does. Then we have another type of neurofeedback where we can go and hover you in that stage 1 sleep. Because that's a therapeutic. Because stage 1 sleep is when you're just coasting off to sleep. You're still thinking everyday thoughts, but everything is calm and quiet. Sometimes your hearing gets very acute, but it sounds distant and echoey. When I was a kid, I loved to hover in that spot. That is when the brain is processing. The first structure in the brain to shut off when you start going to sleep is the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala was increasing that arousal level to reduce the emotional access. First structure to shut off is the amygdala. So when the amygdala shuts off, now the conscious side of the brain no longer has that fear response to the emotional content of the right side of the brain, and the right side of the brain can start presenting subconsciously this emotional stuff, and it gets processed and resolved. What happens if you take a sleeping pill? Blasts you right through stage 1 sleep into deep sleep, and you don't get that therapeutic processing. People who are depressed spend 65% more time in deep REM sleep than the normal person. They're not getting the therapeutic processing time. What if you are the type of person you drive, because you know it's hard to fall asleep, so you exhaust yourself, and so when you hit the bed, you're right out, and you blast right through stage 1 sleep into a deep sleep. And you miss out on the processing, the healing, emotionally healing sleep. So we teach the brain to calm down the high arousal. If the alpha and theta don't restore on their own, we can go to a deep state where we're promoting, we hover you right at stage 1 sleep and let that brain start processing. All right, enough. I got off on a tangent. Yeah, we'll take you first, and then we'll go to you. Yes. Right, because the performance pressure, the performance anxiety is, yeah. Right. You stepped into the lab, and now it's performance. It's not intellectual. Now it's emotional. That can be part of it. Yeah. Yeah. And when you become overwhelmed with the emotional content and your expectations of your learning, the arousal level goes up.
I felt more overwhelmed by the fact that I just didn't understand it at that point.
Mm.
I mean, it wasn't...
And as you calm down, it's easier to understand. It clicks. Because remember those aha moments? Those aha moments were in theta. Very calm, relaxed state. A burst of alpha in theta is that aha moment, that time when everything clicks. And if you are in a high arousal mode, guess what you don't have? Alpha and theta. They're way low. And you, man. Yes.
During the high arousal stage of high data.
Uh-huh.
What are you saying to the neurofeedback training? What arousal level are you helping that person get?
What we're trying to do is, the brain is going to sort out this all on its own. I don't have to go tell it. Now, there are philosophies in neurofeedback that I was originally trained in where we would say, you need more of this, less of this. And so I would train the brain to look more of this, less of this in order to get a therapeutic result. It turns out it works better and faster if I just exercise the brain's ability to self-regulate and let it do it on its own. So when we're entirely symptom-driven, when you say, I have anxiety, I'll of course be differentiating between left side and right side. And so then I'll be targeting that structure. Well, the brain doesn't work entirely independently, so it can't just do that one side. And so if someone is presenting with anxiety, we generally start here to here, in the parietal lobe, calming down the body, relaxing physically and emotionally. Then we'll go here to here. And this is that emotional regulation. Remember, rate and magnitude of response. Then I might add in here to here. Because you know how in your mind you have that self-talk. And sometimes it's negative. It's really tearing you up. Oh, you stupid. Why'd you do that? Oh, you can't do anything right. Quiet that voice down. Streaming thoughts. You have the 100,000 things tumbling through your mind. There's a list that you've got to do, but you can't prioritize one thing or the other because it's just a tumbling mess of thoughts. Here to here, calms that down, lets you put something on the back burner and actually come back to it. And we do them in order because if I calm this down first, where does it put it? I have to prepare the pocket to put it in first. Then we'll add here to here. This is executive function, planning, organization, motivation. We add that in last. That way we'll get that whole brain functioning in the right sequence, because if I exercise this and the rest of it's not ready, what does it do with it? And so we'll be restoring that brain function and then let it select where it goes with the patterns. And it's amazing on the traces to see them resolve over time. And things that are completely inverted, where that alpha and theta are at the bottom, they'll come right back to where they're supposed to be. And the person says, I feel great. Amazing. Now, who else was there? Was it you? Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Yes. Okay. The sensors, I'm asking the brain to make a brain wave under each sensor. The same brain wave. There'll be two active sensors and a ground. And then, so the brain has to generate those two waveforms in the different locations. And then going to ask the brain to change the timing between those two waveforms and maintain that timing shift. I'm doing that. The feedback, the reward is either a video game or a movie. I can drop a movie in, a movie of your choice. The screen size will change. The clarity of the screen may change. The volume level will change. We have a vibrating teddy bear. When you're doing everything right, the teddy bear is vibrating strongly. And when the brain stops doing one of those things, that reward is withheld. The teddy bear will stop vibrating. The screen on the TV will get small, and the brain wants it big so it can see. And so the input, the reward is audio, visual, and tactile. And it's pleasant. And the brain responds to reward better than it does, with an inhibit or, disciplining it when it's doing something wrong. So the mechanism is asking it to generate those waveforms, rewarding it when it does so, and it likes the reward. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. It's entirely different. Melatonin is a very short-acting hormone, and it is regulated by norepinephrine. It can get you to sleep, but it can't keep you there. If you normalize your neurotransmitter levels, then the melatonin will fall into place all on its own. And we have a whole other thing in the office where we can supplement the amino acids that you use to manufacture neurotransmitters. Guided by urinalysis, it customizes the dose for the person. When you're at the optimum level, since 2005, in 1,000 clinics using it, no reported failures for monopolar depression without medications. No reported failures for migraine headaches. No reported failures from fibromyalgia. It's pretty impressive results. Yes, ma'am.
I have a very small population that speaks about what we ran. We're running an outpatient addiction program in Florida. We use the old CAT scan.
Ah, the CAT scan.
The reward for the brain to learn when it needs to be where it is was simply
A tone.
sound.
Yes.
A steady beat or a visual line.
Yes.
It didn't have fancy.
It's really fancy now. I still have one of those CAT scan units.
But I beg people, we've got a whole, like we have 4 stations.
Yes.
We were running it like $5
$5 a session. Yes. 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 Yeah. It works incredibly. Yes. Yeah. It is. Now, in my office, of the people who have done neurofeedback for their addictions, like alcohol or whatever, of those who have done 40 sessions, I've had no one come back to me and relapse. Doesn't mean they haven't told me about it, but I've had no relapses. The difficulty is, on an outpatient basis, is getting them to complete those 40 sessions. They'll come in when the family's in crisis and they've got to do something, they're going to be thrown out, but then they get a little ways in and they, I really like my alcohol. I had one student from Oswego, he had incredible migraine headaches. And on my disclosure and permission consent form, I had there that it may make it so you don't like alcohol. He refused to fix his migraines because he liked his alcohol. I know it's funny, but it's real life and people make real life choices. Okay, any other questions? Insurance, in New York State, insurance does not cover it. They pretend to for migraines. Blue Cross Blue Shield, was it 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago approximately, they sent us a letter saying that they were going to cover neurofeedback for migraine headaches. Wow. Until you read the full letter. In order for them to approve it, they would, first off, they would only approve, I think it was 8 to 12 sessions instead of the 40 that you really need. It's $80 a session. And the criterion for them to begin to pay, you had to have been trialed off the medications on their list and failed at all those medications before they pay for neurofeedback. Well, the list was lengthy, and in order to trial on and off all those, it would take you about 3 years, and then they'd pay for neurofeedback. So it was so they pretend to cover it for migraines. I've never actually seen one. I've had flex spending programs cover it. I've had a few insurances cover it. Workers' comp occasionally has, some automobile accident claims have covered it. I had one gentleman a number of years ago, he was the administrator of his self-funded plan at his work, and his got covered. So, but in general, no. Yes, ma'am. On average, some people are done sooner, some people takes longer. It depends on what we're doing. If we're talking Asperger's or autism, it's going to take longer. If we're talking a panic or an anxiety attack, sometimes those are shorter. Vertigo, often it's just a few sessions. But in general, expect 40. Twice a week for 20 weeks. Yes, ma'am. They evaporate. It's just, one of the guys that trained me, the guy that invented that CAT scan system, the way he put it was that the emotional content, the traumas, were consumed in the flames of consciousness. Because the conscious mind does not, when you're in that high arousal level, it doesn't have access to those low frequency emotional content brainwaves. Once the amygdala is asleep when you're going to sleep, and that fear barrier is removed, then the subconscious mind can present those traumas, those emotional issues, and the left brain resolves them. They're gone. Yeah. They get processed. It just takes care of it. They're gone. They're not there bothering you. Because people who have that backlog of emotional content, it is bothering them all the time, even if they're not aware of it. If they come up on an anniversary of a death or some traumatic event, it's a major thing. They're aware of that date, weeks in advance and then months afterward. Whereas most of us, I can't remember the date my grandfather died. Was it a traumatic event? Yeah, it was. But my brain has processed it. I know approximately the year, give or take a year. Yes. There is a place for that. Talk therapy. If the brain is fully functioning, there are learned behaviors and learned compensating techniques that it has developed over the years. And you have to unlearn them or learn other ways. I had a young woman a number of years ago. She actually went on a radio program with me. She came to me in her late 20s, and she had depression, anxiety, fibromyalgia. She had irritable bowel, you name it, she had it. She had no memories at all before the age of 13. None. She had been to talk therapy and all sorts of stuff, and she said, I don't go anymore. She says, how often can you talk about the same thing? Well, we started doing neurofeedback. And then we did deep state. The deep state unlocked all that memory. In the deep state, she woke up in a fireman's arms. Her house was on fire. The car in the yard was on fire. Her playhouse was on fire. Everything was on fire. Her parents were going through a divorce. Dad torched everything. She had no memories of any of that. She had just shut it off and suppressed it. And we know how you do that. You go to this high level of arousal to suppress that emotional content. And then she was dealing with the effects of that high arousal. The depression, the irritable bowel, the anxiety, that was all the symptoms of the high arousal because her brain was stuck there because it did not want access to that emotional content. Once we gave her access, it withdraws. She said, now I can go back to the therapist because now I can process this stuff. I had a gentleman who was 15 years dry. Every day he wanted a drink. He went to AA every day for 15 years. He came to me and he was on the verge of losing his third wife. we started doing the neurofeedback, and he came in and he said, you know, all those things that I was taught all those years, I couldn't put into place. I did not have the emotional ability to do any of that. He says, now I do. He was able to save his marriage, and he's functioning at a very high level. And all his cravings went away. You know, pretty cool. And yes, ma'am. If the person is currently being exposed to a chemical or otherwise trauma, it can interfere with that. We're exercising that neuron bundle. If that neuron bundle does not have enough neurotransmitters or the ability to function, I can't exercise it. I might get a temporary boost, and then it goes back. I had a kid with fetal alcohol syndrome a number of years ago. It was 2006. They were driving from Albany all the way out here twice a week. And remember the gas prices back then? They were way up. Neurofeedback would work very well for a few hours. They'd get back home, and he was a little terror that he had been. We added the amino acid supplement program. He was the first child I did it with. Once he had enough neuronal function from the supplementation, then the neurofeedback worked, and then we were able to withdraw all of it. Because what happened was, when that little brain was building inside mama, and mama is using recreational whatever, if that axon needed 5 synapses, maybe it only grew 2. Because it was flooded with neurotransmitters, artificially high levels induced by the recreational drug of choice. Then, when the child is born and it no longer has those artificially high levels, 2 aren't enough. And it gets intermittent function or non-function, and that regulatory process isn't there. So the anger management, the conduct management isn't there. Neurofeedback, I couldn't get enough on it to rebuild it. Supplemented it, flooded that neuron bundle with lots of neurotransmitters as it had been in mama. Now 2 work. When I exercise it, it grows more. And then we were able to withdraw all. Yes. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. I have worked with Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is very challenging. With neurofeedback alone, we can slow the progress of that illness to the point where it appears stopped, but it's not. If they take a break for a week, go visit the grandkids, steep decline. I can stabilize it again, but I can't regain. So it's a series of steep stair steps every time I take a vacation. I can restore the emotional function. Often they come to me and they're anxious, they're fearful, they're depressed. They know what's happening to them and they don't like it. And I can calm down that emotional response to their illness. But the cognition, I don't have good success in increasing that cognition. The amino acid formula does have success in increasing the cognition. The guy that developed it, he's in semi-retirement in Cape Coral, Florida. His next-door neighbor he was a renowned chef. The wife came to Dr. Hinz and said, he can't even cook breakfast anymore. Put him on the amino acid formula, now he's back cooking full meals. So you kind of have to try and see what works. Unfortunately, there's no fixed thing, as much as I would like it to be. Yes, ma'am. There are a number of books, getting one that covers it. Let me see. A Symphony in the Brain by Jim Robbins gives a history of the development of neurofeedback, and it's written. He's a writer for like science magazines. He's a consumer writer, so he's writing at an entertaining level. For ADHD, there's a book, ADHD, The 20-Hour Solution by Othmer. There are 2 copies of it in the Baldwinsville Library, so you can get it on interlibrary loan. You know, just go to your local library, they'll get it shipped out in a day. Othmer, O-T-H-M-E-R. Yes. Yes. Anxiety, plan on 40. Sometimes you're done earlier than that. Most of the time, it lasts for a long time, presumably life. I have some that come back. For example, I have a young lady, she's a teacher in the Utica-Rome area, middle 30s. Extreme anxiety. First 3 times she came to my office, she had her mother with her and her husband with her. She sat in my easy chair and cried for an hour for 3 sessions. I never touched her. She'd call me on the phone between sessions wondering if I was going to hurt her brain. Was this ECT? What was going to happen to me? Anxiety. Finally, she let me put the sensors on her head. And all her anxiety went away. She completed more than 40 sessions. Anytime she's in Syracuse, she comes back because she doesn't want it ever to come back. She came back last fall because she was going to go on a trip to Ireland for a week during spring break. And she had a fear of flying. She didn't want to have any anxiety. Gave her a session. Her trip was fine. Sometimes it'll break through transiently. She stopped all of her medications about a month ago and came back in, was it 2 weeks ago, with anxiety. We settled that down. So for most people, it lasts long term, and the effects are profound. I have a young woman who just got done with. She came to me over the winter, and she was a new graduate nurse practitioner. She had anxiety, but she didn't think it was a whole lot. Calmed her down, and she said, all these symptoms that I never associated with anxiety are gone. She used to pee all the time. If she came here, her first place to stop is the restroom. When she's in her shopping, she goes to the restroom. Before she leaves her house, she goes to the restroom. Any place, she knew where the restroom was. Now, she 2-3 times a day. That's it. Now, she a whole long laundry list of things that she did not recognize as anxiety symptoms that all went away. She actually then went off the amino acid protocol because she wanted more, and she's thrilled. She started doing the amino acids. Yes. Meditation. Meditators go to that alpha and to some extent the theta. It's the brain state that you're trying to achieve. That brain state is characterized by a profound sense of well-being, comfort in your own skin. You're comfortable with your place in the world. Everything is perfect. And if you've never experienced it, it's hard to get to by verbal descriptions. They do it by controlling their breath, controlling their thoughts, yoga, their guided imagery. There's a whole lot of ways to get a case of beer. And so you're attempting to get brain state. And by being able to brain state with you. Continuing vigilance with my hand. Once you learn your way there, it's easier to get back there, and you can do throughout the day. That's the of the meditation, is to keep that sense of profound through everything. In alpha state, you cannot have anxiety. Fear. It's a different that has shut down that in order to go into the anxiety. And what feedback does is it allows the brain to transition between states without getting stuck there. So you can go to your calm state. But when you need to focus, you can focus. The ADHD or the ADD, he can be in that calm state, but he can't focus. He's stuck. The person who is stuck in the over-arousal, they can't transition to the calm state. You know, it's like there's a gear missing in the transmission. When the brain is functioning well, it's plastic. It can flow from one state to the other without getting stuck seamlessly. Like the guy that got in the auto accident. He handled everything fine. And then afterward, he's like, wow, I did that. A woman in the office just Thursday, she's in her 60s, and she said, I can cope. You know what it's like to be able to cope? Things came up that would normally ruin your day and stress you all out, and she said, it just rolled off my back. I could cope. Or my current client with the rage disorder, he doesn't blow up every time. And now he has the hope that his daughter will forget what he was like. That, yeah, but she's pretty young. So hopefully.